October 1929, Chicago. The stock market crashed and the Great Depression began, turning America's economy into a nightmare. Within months, unemployment in Chicago reached 30%. Factories closed, banks failed, families lost everything. By early 1930, thousands of Chicago families were starving, literally starving, with no money for food, no jobs to earn money, and no government programs to help them. But something strange started happening in the poorest neighborhoods of Chicago. Every morning, families would find packages on their doorsteps. Brown paper packages containing bread, canned goods, vegetables, sometimes meat. No note, no explanation, just the packages and 3 words written on each one. From a friend. Nobody knew who was leaving these packages. Nobody saw the delivery people. The packages just appeared, like magic, at dozens of locations across the city every single day. The police investigated. The newspapers speculated. The churches wondered. But the truth remained hidden for 5 years, because the truth was impossible to believe. Chicago's most notorious criminal was running the largest secret charity operation in American history, using his network of underground tunnels to feed 50,000 families, and nobody except his closest men knew about it. This is the story of the Silent Army, the operation that FBI tried to stop but couldn't, and the mystery that Chicago has never fully solved. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because in upcoming episodes, we'll be telling other extraordinary stories about the hidden infrastructure that fed a city during its darkest days. The crash. When America stopped working, the Great Depression wasn't just an economic downturn, it was a complete collapse of the American way of life. In October 1929, the stock market lost nearly half its value in a matter of days. Banks that had invested heavily in stocks suddenly had no money. Businesses that depended on bank loans couldn't operate. Factories that made products nobody could afford to buy had to close, and workers who lost their jobs had no safety net to catch them. There was no unemployment insurance, no food stamps, no welfare system. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. And by 1930, millions of Americans weren't working. Chicago was hit particularly hard. The city's economy was built on manufacturing, steel mills, stockyards, factories. When demand collapsed, these industries shut down almost overnight. The unemployment rate in Chicago reached 35% by the summer of 1930, and in some neighborhoods, particularly immigrant neighborhoods like Little Italy and the Polish districts, unemployment was over 50%. Entire blocks where every man had worked were now blocks where nobody worked. Families burned furniture for heat. Children wore shoes made from cardboard. And hunger, real desperate hunger, became a daily reality for thousands of people. The city government tried to help, but Chicago was broke. Tax revenues had collapsed along with the economy, and the city could barely afford to pay its own employees, let alone fund relief programs. Private charities did what they could. Churches ran soup kitchens. The Salvation Army distributed what food they had. But the need was overwhelming, and the resources were nowhere near sufficient. By the winter of 1930, it was estimated that over 100,000 Chicagoans were on the edge of starvation. People were dying, mostly the elderly and the very young, from malnutrition and diseases made worse by hunger. Chicago, one of America's greatest cities, was facing a humanitarian crisis. Capone seized the crisis. The decision. Al Capone was, ironically, one of the few people in Chicago who wasn't affected by the Depression. His business, bootlegging alcohol, actually thrived during economic hardship because people wanted to drink away their problems. Capone's income remained steady. His organization remained strong, and his empire continued to operate smoothly while everything else collapsed. But Capone wasn't isolated from the suffering around him. He saw it every day. He saw the bread lines, the homeless men sleeping in doorways, the children with hollow eyes and thin faces, and it bothered him. In December 1930, Capone did something unusual. He opened 3 soup kitchens in Chicago, public operations where anyone could come and get a free meal, no questions asked. These soup kitchens served thousands of meals a day. Capone personally funded them, spending thousands of dollars a week to keep them running. The newspapers covered this extensively, some praising Capone's generosity, others cynically suggesting he was just trying to improve his public image before his upcoming tax trial. Capone didn't care what the newspapers said. He kept the soup kitchens running, but as successful as they were, Capone knew they weren't enough. The soup kitchens fed maybe 5,000 people a day. Chicago needed to feed 100,000. One evening in January 1931, Capone was in his office reviewing the costs of the soup kitchen operation when Frank Nitti came in with an idea. Nitti suggested they could do more, much more, if they used the tunnel system. The tunnels allowed Capone's organization to move goods all over Chicago invisibly. They had been using the tunnels to move alcohol for years. Why not use them to move food? Capone listened to Nitty's proposal and immediately saw the potential. The soup kitchens were visible, public, and therefore limited. But a distribution network using the tunnels could be invisible, limitless, and most importantly, impossible for authorities to stop. Capone made his decision that night. He would create a secret network to feed Chicago's hungry, using the same infrastructure he used for his illegal business. The operation would be completely covert. No publicity, no credit, no recognition. Just food delivered silently to people who needed it. Building the silent army. Organization and infrastructure. Capone approached the logistics of feeding thousands of families with the same strategic mind he used to run his criminal empire. First, he needed supply. He reached out to his contacts in the food industry, wholesalers and warehouse owners who supplied goods to restaurants and stores. Capone made deals. He would buy massive quantities of non-perishable food at bulk prices. Canned goods, flour, rice, dried beans, bread, potatoes, occasionally meat when it was available. He set up a purchasing operation that bought tons of food every week. The suppliers didn't ask questions. Money was money, and Capone paid in cash. Second, he needed storage. Capone designated several locations in his tunnel system as food warehouses. These weren't the tunnels used for alcohol operations. Capone was careful to keep the two operations separate. The food storage tunnels were dry, cool, and had enough space to store weeks' worth of supplies. Capone hired men to work as warehouse managers, keeping inventory, ensuring food didn't spoil, rotating stock to use older items first. This was run like a professional distribution business, because essentially that's what it was. Third, he needed distribution routes. Capone's organization mapped out Chicago's poorest neighborhoods and identified the families that needed help most. They used a variety of sources for this information: church records, school attendance lists, reports from social workers, and most effectively, information from Capone's own network of informants who lived in these neighborhoods and knew which families were struggling. Once they identified families in need, they plotted distribution routes through the tunnel system. The tunnels had exits all over Chicago, in basements, in old buildings, in forgotten spaces. Capone's men would emerge from these exits in the early morning hours before dawn, when the streets were empty. They would leave packages at designated doorsteps, then disappear back underground before anyone saw them. Fourth, he needed people to run the operation. Capone assigned 30 of his men full-time to what they internally called the food operation. These men weren't thugs or enforcers. They were the reliable, trustworthy members of the organization, men who could be counted on to follow orders precisely and keep their mouths shut. Each man was responsible for a specific route and a specific set of families. They would load their packages in the tunnels, carry them to their assigned exit, deliver them quickly and quietly, and return. The operation ran 7 days a week, every single day, rain or shine, winter or summer. It was like a military operation in its precision and dedication. The operation, 5 years of secret deliveries. The first deliveries began in February 1931. 20 families in Little Italy woke up to find packages on their doorsteps. Brown paper wrapped around food, tied with string, and marked with the simple message, "From a friend." The families were confused, but grateful. They asked neighbors if anyone knew where the packages came from. Nobody did. The next day, 30 more families received packages, then 50. Within a week, over 200 families across multiple neighborhoods were receiving regular food deliveries, and nobody had any idea who was responsible. The packages were carefully assembled. Each one contained enough food for a family of 4 to eat for 3 days. Bread, canned vegetables, canned soup, beans, rice, sometimes pasta. Occasionally there would be extras, a bit of cheese, some fruit, a small piece of meat. The food was basic but nutritious, the kind of food that would keep a family from starving. The packages arrived with remarkable regularity. Families could count on getting a delivery every 3 days like clockwork. And that regularity was almost as important as the food itself, because it gave families hope. They knew that even if they had no money, even if they had no work, they wouldn't starve. Someone, somewhere, cared enough to make sure they could eat. As weeks turned to months, the operation expanded. By the summer of 1931, Capone's silent army was delivering food to over 1,000 families. By the end of 1931, 3,000 families. By 1932, 5,000 families. The operation kept growing because the Depression kept getting worse. More people lost jobs, more families fell into poverty, and Capone's organization kept adding them to the delivery list. The cost was enormous. Capone was spending an estimated $20,000 a week on food purchases alone, plus the operational costs of running the distribution network. Over a year, that was over $1 million, equivalent to roughly $20 million in today's money. But Capone never complained about the cost, never cut the program, never even reduced the amount of food in each package. If anything, he occasionally increased it. The secrecy of the operation was maintained through strict discipline. The men who worked on the food operation were forbidden from talking about it, even to other members of Capone's organization. The tunnel routes were known only to those who used them. The supply chain was compartmentalized so that no one person knew the entire system except Capone and Nitti. And most importantly, the deliveries were made at times and in ways that avoided detection. Deliveries happened before dawn when streets were empty. The packages were left, and the deliverers vanished within seconds. If anyone happened to see a delivery, they saw a man in ordinary clothes leaving a package. Nothing obviously criminal or suspicious. The investigation. FBI tries to stop it. The FBI noticed the mysterious food deliveries by mid-1931. Agents investigating Capone's organization for tax evasion kept hearing stories about food packages appearing in Italian and Polish neighborhoods. At first, they assumed it was some kind of protection racket, that Capone was distributing food to buy loyalty or silence. But as they investigated further, they realized something strange. Nobody was being asked for anything in return. The food was genuinely free, no strings attached. This confused the FBI. Why would Capone give away food for nothing? Federal agent Elliot Ness, who was leading the effort to bring down Capone, suspected the food operation was somehow connected to Capone's bootlegging business. Maybe the food packages were a cover for alcohol deliveries. Maybe the tunnels used for food were also used for illegal goods. Ness assigned agents to surveil the neighborhoods where packages appeared, trying to catch the delivery people in the act. But Capone's men were too careful. They knew they were being watched, and they adjusted their tactics. They changed delivery times, changed routes, used lookouts to make sure no law enforcement was around before making deliveries. In 6 months of surveillance, FBI agents never once caught a Capone man making a food delivery. Ness tried a different approach. He had agents interview families who received the packages, trying to get information about who was delivering them. But the families genuinely didn't know. They just found packages on their doorsteps. Ness tried to trace the food supply chain, checking with wholesalers to see who was buying large quantities of food. But Capone's purchasing operation used multiple intermediaries and shell companies, making it nearly impossible to trace the food back to him. Ness even considered trying to follow the packages backward, staking out a doorstep before dawn to see where the delivery person came from. But Chicago had thousands of doorsteps, and Capone was delivering to dozens of locations every day. The FBI didn't have enough manpower to watch everywhere. The truth was that Ness and the FBI were trying to stop a humanitarian operation, and that put them in an impossible position morally and practically. Morally, how do you justify shutting down a program that's feeding starving families, even if it's run by a criminal? Practically, how do you stop an operation that uses a vast underground tunnel network you don't have maps for and can't effectively patrol? Ness eventually gave up trying to stop the food operation and refocused on the tax case against Capone. He later admitted in private conversations that the food operation was one of the few things Capone did that he actually respected. The impact: 50,000 families from 1931 to 1936. Capone's silent army operated continuously. Even after Capone was imprisoned in 1931, he left instructions for the operation to continue, and Frank Nitti kept it running. The operation fed an estimated 50,000 different families over those 5 years. Some families received deliveries for just a few months until they got back on their feet. Others received deliveries for years. The impact was impossible to measure precisely, but social workers and churches in Chicago's poor neighborhoods noticed something remarkable. Despite the depression getting worse, malnutrition rates didn't increase in the neighborhoods where Capone's deliveries were happening. Children in those areas were healthier than children in similar areas that weren't receiving deliveries. The death rate from starvation-related causes was lower. The Silent Army was making a real, measurable difference in thousands of lives. But perhaps even more remarkable was what the operation did psychologically. The depression destroyed people's sense of hope and dignity. Men who couldn't feed their families felt worthless. Women who watched their children go hungry felt helpless. But the mysterious deliveries, the regular packages that appeared like clockwork, gave people something to hold on to. The message on each package, from a friend, suggested that someone cared. that they weren't forgotten. This psychological impact was as important as the physical food. It kept despair from turning into complete hopelessness. The end, when the secret couldn't be kept anymore. The food operation ended in 1936, not because Capone's organization wanted it to end, but because circumstances changed. First, the economy started to slowly recover. The worst of the Depression was over, and some people were finding work again. Second, President Roosevelt's New Deal programs began providing government assistance, unemployment benefits, and work programs that reduced the desperate need. Third, and most importantly, law enforcement pressure on Capone's organization increased. With Capone in prison and the organization under constant FBI surveillance, maintaining the tunnel operations became more difficult. Frank Nitti made the decision to shut down the food operation because continuing it risked exposing the tunnel system entirely, which would have destroyed Capone's remaining bootlegging operations. The deliveries stopped, gradually over several months in late 1936. Families who had received packages for years suddenly found their doorsteps empty. Many of them wrote to newspapers asking if anyone knew what happened to their mysterious benefactor. The Chicago Tribune published a story titled, "The Friend Disappears," about the end of the mysterious food deliveries. But the article couldn't explain who had been behind them or why they stopped. To this day, most Chicago historians assume the food deliveries were some kind of charity program run by churches or private donors. Very few know the truth. The legacy, kindness from an unlikely source years later. In the 1940s, Frank Nitti told his lawyer about the Silent Army. The lawyer, bound by attorney-client privilege, couldn't reveal the information while Nitti was alive. But after Nitti's death in 1943, the lawyer included the story in his memoirs. That's how historians eventually learned the truth about who fed Chicago during the Depression. But by then, the story had become almost mythical, too strange to fully believe. A gangster secretly feeding 50,000 families. It sounded like fiction, but the evidence supports it. The tunnel system existed. The deliveries happened. The costs matched Capone's financial records. And dozens of former Capone organization members, in interviews over the decades, confirmed that the food operation was real. The Silent Army represents something important about human nature and morality. Al Capone was a criminal who hurt many people, but he was also capable of extraordinary compassion. These two truths coexist. His charity doesn't erase his crimes, but his crimes don't erase his charity. He was complicated, contradictory, fully human. And during Chicago's darkest hour, he used his criminal infrastructure to do something genuinely good, something that saved thousands of lives, something he never sought credit for. Today, walk through Chicago's old Little Italy neighborhood or the Polish districts on the south side, and you'll meet elderly residents who remember the Depression. Some of them will tell you about the mysterious packages that appeared on doorsteps, about the friend they never met but never forgot. And if you ask them who they think their benefactor was, some will smile and say nothing, because some secrets, even 90 years later, are still worth keeping.